Everything I'm looking at here for sale or...
A lot of stuff is for sale.
Frank Fritz from the History Channel's reality series American Pickers has died.
For 4 years, Mike Wolfe said nothing in his own defense. Then, in February 2026, he finally spoke. And what he said didn't just answer the questions. It exposed something about Frank that Mike refused to say while Frank was still alive.
The U.S. Sun has obtained first photos of Mike days after the passing of his beloved friend and longtime co-star, Frank Fritz.
Something that changes every argument you've ever had about this feud. Was the feud ever real to begin with? And why did Mike choose silence over his own reputation for 4 straight years?
So, we've been very blessed. We've had the same crew for 13 years. And so everybody I work with was very close to Frank.
What the public was told. Frank Fritz was not a television personality who stumbled into antiques. He had spent 25 years as a fire and safety inspector in Davenport, Iowa, while quietly building something on the side, a shop called Frank Fritz Finds in Savannah, Illinois, stocked with vintage motorcycles, industrial hardware, and collectibles sourced from across the Midwest. He owned over 100 bikes personally and attended the Sturgis Motorcycle Rally for more than 30 consecutive years. He had co-written 2 books on picking and vintage motorcycles before a single camera ever pointed at him. Frank and Mike had first met in 8th grade in Bettendorf, Iowa. 2 kids drawn to the same forgotten barns and rusted garages, who spent the next 4 decades picking together before the world knew either of their names. His manager later said Frank knew more about Americana than anyone he had ever met. When American Pickers premiered in January 2010, Frank was not playing a character. He was just being himself. That was the whole point. He was there 1 week and gone the next, with no explanation given to the millions of viewers who had watched him every week for a decade. The History Channel said nothing. Mike said nothing. And for over a year, the silence became the only story anyone could tell. Then, in 2021, Frank broke that silence himself. In a series of interviews, Frank laid out what he said had happened behind the scenes. He claimed Mike had known about his back surgery and never once reached out. 2 years had passed without a single conversation between them. Frank described feeling sidelined, convinced the show had always been built around Mike in ways that left him with almost no real standing. Mike's official farewell statement, Frank said, had been written by someone else entirely. And the chemistry the two of them had built over 40 years, Frank insisted, was something no replacement could ever recreate. Fan forums divided into camps. Comment sections on every American Pickers post became a place to argue, assign blame, and relitigate a falling out most viewers only knew through one side of the story. Frank did not speak in vague generalities. He named specific things: the surgery, the silence, 2 years without a single call. And every detail landed hard because the friendship itself had been so visible for so long. These were concrete accusations against a man he had known since 8th grade. Viewers had watched them together for over a decade and thought they understood the relationship. Frank's interviews told them they had been wrong. Mike's response at the time was a carefully worded public statement, expressing warmth and wishing Frank well. He didn't push back, didn't offer a counter-narrative, didn't explain himself. He just went quiet. To the public watching from the outside, that silence looked like confirmation. A guilty man staying out of the line of fire. A friend who had moved on and had nothing to say in his own defense. That was the version that existed for 4 years. But there was something Frank never mentioned in any of those interviews. Something nobody reported. And it changes everything. So what was it? The thing nobody reported. Before Frank Fritz ever missed a drug test, before the guardianship, before the stroke, There was a back injury that most of the public never fully understood. During the pandemic shutdown in 2020, Frank hurt his back while moving things at home. The injury sounded manageable. It was not. Frank had been living with Crohn's disease for years, a long-term inflammatory condition that had gradually weakened his bones without most viewers knowing. When the back gave out, the damage was severe enough to require major surgery, including the insertion of spinal rods and a recovery that stretched across months with no clear end point. Surgeons prescribed opioids for the pain. Frank's history with alcohol did not start in 2020. In 2017, after a broken engagement left him in serious personal trouble, he was arrested for driving the wrong way on a highway while under the influence of alcohol and Xanax. He checked himself into the Abbey Center in Bettendorf and stayed for 77 days. He came out sober. He stayed that way for 11 months. Then he relapsed, and by the time the pandemic shut everything down in 2020, he had already been drinking again for over a year. The surgery and the opioids arrived on top of that. That combination, opioids on top of relapsed drinking, inside a body that had just been through major surgery, during a pandemic that had stripped away every routine keeping him upright, was why Frank never came back. What finished Frank wasn't the surgery. It was everything around it. Isolation, opioids, alcohol, and a pandemic that stripped away every structure keeping him stable. His engagement to Deanne Bankson had ended. The show was gone. His routines were gone. And the people who had kept him accountable from inside the addiction, as they had already moved on without him. When American Pickers resumed production, the History Channel required clean drug tests from its cast. Frank was unable to pass them. Not a power struggle, not Mike engineering a takeover, a failed drug test, and a network that couldn't wait. The network moved forward without him, and nobody said so publicly, because saying so publicly would have required burning Frank in the press at the lowest point of his life. Mike knew, the people close to Frank knew, and even the network knew, and all of them stayed quiet. The version Frank gave in his 2021 interviews was not a fabrication. Frank believed every word of it. But Frank was describing his experience from inside an active addiction, at a moment when the people trying to help him had become, in his mind, the people who had failed him. Show in decline. While Frank was gone and the public was still arguing about who was to blame, the show itself was quietly falling apart. The show Frank and Mike had built together had gone from 3.1 million viewers to under 750,000. The Nashville store had closed. When the show returned without Frank, the network brought in new pickers to fill the gap. Robbie Wolfe, Mike's brother, was added to the rotation. So was Jersey John Saleh. Neither of them was Frank. Viewers noticed immediately and said so loudly in reviews, in comment sections, and in rating drops that showed up episode by episode. The format was the same. The chemistry wasn't. And without that chemistry, the show that had once pulled over 3 million viewers a week started bleeding audience it never got back. In December 2025, Danielle Colby posted a video to Instagram telling her followers directly that American Pickers was done. She described herself as standing at a crossroads, said she had already laid out her next steps, and acknowledged that without the show's financial support, things were going to be difficult. The History Channel issued a statement saying her claim had no truth to it, then confirmed in the same statement that no new episodes were currently in production and that a season 28 had not been ordered. A full season had already been filmed and was sitting unreleased. The network said it could potentially return to production, but offered no date. What addiction did to the story. Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe had known each other since the 8th grade in Bettendorf, Iowa. Not as television co-stars, but as friends who had shared nearly 30 years of history before any camera ever pointed at them. Frank was godfather to Mike's brother, Robbie's twin daughters. They had traveled together before any show existed, across decades that had nothing to do with television. The friendship was the foundation. The show was built on top of it. That history was precisely what gave Frank's accusations so much weight. When Frank said Mike had gone silent during his surgery, the accusation landed hard precisely because the history behind it was real and decades long. The idea that Mike would simply stop calling felt like a genuine rupture, not a manufactured one. He was describing what he experienced as real, because to him, it was real. Addiction didn't just change behavior, it rewrote memory. The concern Frank received started reading as control. The intervention read as betrayal. Mike's silence, meant to protect him, read as proof he had already moved on. Frank wasn't lying. He was telling the truth exactly as his addiction had arranged it for him. And from the inside, there was no way to see the difference. Mike and others close to Frank had staged an intervention. Frank pushed back, saying he could handle it himself. People around him could see clearly that he could not. After the intervention, Mike ran into Frank and asked how he was doing. Frank said he was fine. He was not fine. The gap between what Frank reported about himself and what the people around him could observe widened throughout 2020 and into 2021. That gap was the feud, a man in serious trouble who had convinced himself the people trying to reach him had already given up. What the internet never understood was that both of them were right. Frank wasn't lying. Mike wasn't lying. The feud was simultaneously real and not real, depending entirely on which side of addiction you were standing on. From Frank's side, the abandonment was genuine. From Mike's side, the silence was protection. What Mike did inside that nursing home changed everything between them. How? The room nobody covered. On July 14, 2022, Frank was found unresponsive at his home in Davenport and rushed to the hospital. The stroke was severe. In the months that followed, he lost much of his ability to speak and move and was placed in a wheelchair. His recovery was complicated by hospitalizations for seizures, elevated blood pressure, and symptoms resembling pneumonia. In August 2022, within weeks of the stroke, the court had placed Frank under emergency guardianship, and he could no longer make decisions for himself. He was completely dependent on the people around him. The court named Frank's close friend, Chris Davis, as his personal guardian, and appointed Midwest One Bank as conservator over his finances. The same people who would later be named in his will were the ones now legally responsible for his life. And through that entire period, the seizures, the hospitalizations, the slow work of existing inside a body, the stroke had fundamentally changed. The people around him said Frank remained more clear-minded than the public coverage ever suggested. Frank disappeared into a private medical situation nobody chose to broadcast. Over Memorial Day weekend in 2023, Mike made a specific trip to see Frank for the first time in approximately 3 years. Both men were emotional when they saw each other. According to people close to Frank, it was Frank who had finally indicated he was ready for the visit. Frank, from inside the guardianship, from inside everything the stroke had taken from him, had still been the one to open the door. He chose the moment. He let Mike back in on his own terms. After that visit, Mike began making the drive from Tennessee to Iowa regularly. He brought his phone to show Frank photos of things he had found on the road, the same thing the two of them had done together for nearly 40 years. They talked about what they had built, the objects, the finds, the years in the van. Frank could barely speak. Mike did most of the talking. Frank could still respond, still react, still laugh at certain things. Those were the visits the internet never knew were happening, and they kept happening quietly until Frank was gone. Mike had said none of it publicly, and he wouldn't, until the launch of a new show forced the conversation he had been avoiding for 4 years. Mike confirms everything. On February 22nd, 2026, History's Greatest Picks with Mike Wolfe debuted on the History Channel at 9 p.m. The 8-episode series featured Mike hosting solo, exploring the stories and shifting value behind legendary artifacts from American history, focusing on items found by other collectors rather than his own picks. The show was produced by Cineflix, timed to the History Channel's push around America's 250th anniversary. Mike hosted and executive produced, on the same History Channel, a completely different show. Around the launch of the new show, Mike finally sat down and addressed what had actually happened. He said the silence was never indifference. It was a choice to protect Frank from having his addiction exposed in the press without his knowledge or consent. Frank had been battling opioids on top of alcohol, inside a body that had just been through major spinal surgery during a pandemic, in complete isolation. Mike knew. The people around Frank knew. And going public with that, while Frank was still alive, still fighting, still trying to hold some version of his life together, would have taken the last thing Frank had left. Going public would have cost Frank the one thing he still had. So Mike said nothing. For 4 years, he absorbed every accusation, every comment section argument, every headline about a falling out and a power grab. And he said nothing. Because saying something meant burning Frank in public at the worst moment of his life. And he wasn't willing to do that. He also confirmed, publicly and for the first time, that he had been in that room. That he had driven through the night from Tennessee. That he had held Frank's hand, told him he loved him. And when it became clear Frank was struggling, told him to go find his mom. He said he felt grateful he had made it in time. He was there when Frank took his last breath and closed Frank's eyes. He had carried all of that privately since September 2024 and said none of it until February 2026. Mike also said something else publicly around this same time, something about the new show, about how none of it would exist without the foundation Frank helped build. He said that on camera, publicly, for the first time. Frank was already gone, but what he left behind was about to become the center of a legal fight nobody saw coming. Frank's death. Mike reached Frank's bedside approximately 1 hour before Frank died. He stayed beside him, held his hand, and was present when Frank took his last breath. Frank Fritz died on September 30th, 2024, at 60 years old, his death certificate listing the cause as late sequela of cerebral infarction, with cerebral vascular disease and aortic stenosis recorded as contributing conditions. That same night, Mike posted a tribute. Not about the show, not about the ratings or the network, or what Frank's absence had cost either of them professionally. He wrote about the years before any camera was ever pointed at them, the cargo van, the road trips, the places nobody else knew existed and nobody else cared about. He called Frank a dreamer, said he was just as sensitive as he was funny. 2 sentences that told you more about what Mike had actually lost than 4 years of silence ever did. Danielle Colby posted separately, writing about Frank's humor, his love for his cat and his mother, and the moments on set that never made it to air. Robbie Wolfe, who had known Frank since the 6th grade, long before any show, long before any camera, posted about the fishing trips, the boat, The 40 years of a friendship that had nothing to do with television. He asked Frank to hold the boat steady until they met again. 3 different people, 3 completely different relationships with the same man. All of them are posting on the same night. Frank had signed a will in 2023, approximately 8 months after the guardianship order had been put in place, naming his close friends as beneficiaries, the same people who had driven him to appointments, sat with him through the seizures, and stayed when staying was hard. It was submitted to probate on October 18, 2024. Then Bill Fritz filed to contest it. His lawyers argued Frank wasn't mentally fit to sign anything, pointing to the guardianship as proof. Then they went further, claiming the will was an outright fraud. Frank never signed it at all. A second challenge landed shortly after, demanding a full jury trial. Frank's friends, named as defendants, rejected both arguments. They maintained that Frank had been clear-minded and communicative when the will was signed, and that the court's prior acceptance of the document carried legal weight. Court records from the guardianship proceedings noted Frank maintained contact with no living relatives. Bill had visited once in more than 2 years of post-stroke recovery. Frank had asked for a specific send-off, his ashes carried on a motorcycle through the Quad Cities, with live music and a crowd. That ride had not happened. The probate case remained open and unresolved into early 2026, holding everything in place. Frank's final wish still hadn't happened, and the people he trusted most were now defendants in a courtroom fight they never expected. If Mike Wolfe had gone public about Frank's addiction while Frank was still alive, would that have helped Frank or destroyed the last thing he had left? And if Frank's own father is the one standing between Frank's final wish and the people Frank chose to leave everything to, what does that say about what family actually means? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.